Today on Straight Talk Africa, it seems to be political deja vu all over again in East Africa. The Rwandan president is re-elected for another 7 years, and in Kenya, preliminary results put incumbent President Uhuru Kenyatta ahead of longtime rival Raila Odinga. But the opposition says it will not accept the results because it alleges hackers carried out, quote, massive and extensive fraud. That's coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America studios here in Washington. I am Shaka Sali. A programming note. For the next few weeks, my colleague Paul Ndiho will join me on a special assignment in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and Tanzania.
And hello to all our viewers and listeners on the continent and elsewhere. I'm Ayan Bior, your social media reporter.
Today, we are discussing Tuesday's Kenyan presidential poll and the re-election of Rwandan President, Major General Paul Kagame.
And coming up later, our audience has weighed in on our topic through emails, Facebook, and Twitter comments, and we'll reveal some of them ahead on Straight Talk Africa.
A near-perfect election in Rwanda, and a tense and so far inconclusive election result in Kenya. My colleague Paul Cisco has more.
Watershed, a point of division between two periods of history. The definition for the English word is being used to describe the presidential election in Kenya between incumbent President Uhuru Kenyatta and former Prime Minister Raila Odinga. In Rwanda, the race for the presidency was never in doubt, as President Paul Kagame easily extended his 17-year reign with a landslide victory in what he had called a formality. Rwandans are facing another 7 years with Paul Kagame leading the small East African nation. Kagame has earned praise for Rwanda's economic performance, but he is also strongly criticized for silencing his opponents. He won his third 7-year term with nearly 99% of the vote on Friday, a powerful mandate. More than 6.6 million votes were cast for the incumbent and just over 80,000 for the two opposition candidates. Challenger Frank Habineza received about 0.4% of the vote.
Of the 2017 presidential elections were indeed not pleasing as we had expected. However, as a Democrat, I'd like to take on this opportunity to congratulate the RPF candidate, Paul Kagame, for the victory and wish him all the best.
Kagame has led Rwanda since his rebel forces won the brutal 1994 civil war, ending the Rwandan genocide that killed some 800,000 people, mainly minority Tutsis. He's credited with a remarkable turnaround in Rwanda, which boasts annual economic growth of about 7%. However, human rights groups accuse him of ruling through fear and intimidation and systematic repression of the opposition by curbing free speech and silencing some media outlets and the opposition. In Kenya, the results are still being tabulated in the race between President Uhuru Kenyatta and his longtime rival Raila Odinga. The Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, IEBC, website showed at midday Wednesday about 94% of the ballots had been counted, with Kenyatta leading 54% to 45% in his bid for another term. Kenyan opposition leader Odinga says hackers carried out massive and extensive fraud against the Election Commission's computer system, resulting in what he asserts are fraudulent vote totals, showing him trailing well behind President Kenyatta. The IEBC chairman says he will investigate the charges. Many Kenyans stood in long lines before dawn and well into the evening, choosing not only a president, but senators, governors, women's representatives of the National Assembly, and the members of the National and County Assemblies. The polls were extended for hours, so everyone in line could mark their ballots. Raphael Tuju, Secretary General of Kenyatta's Jubilee Party, dismissed Odinga's accusations as disingenuous and appealed for calm. The two men faced each other in presidential elections in 2007 and 2013. Odinga alleged vote tampering after losing in 2013 and challenged the result in court, later accepting the Supreme Court's ruling and defeat. Election officials have up to a week to announce the full results. Earlier, former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, an election monitor with the U.S.-based Carter Center, said the vote is critical for the people of Kenya.
Obviously, the transition from voting to counting is going to be critical, and there's a process in place for that, too. That's why it's too early for us to be drawing any kinds of conclusions, but we'll see where it goes.
Kenya's Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission's major responsibilities include collecting and counting the votes from some 40,000 polling stations across the country. Days before the vote, security concerns intensified with the disappearance, torture, and killing of Christopher Masando just days ago. Mr. Masando was in charge of information, communication, and technology for the IEBC. According to the Kenyan Constitution, if neither Kenyatta or Odinga receive more than 50% of the vote and 25% or more of votes in at least 25 of Kenya's 47 counties, Kenyans will return to the polls and vote in the nation's first ever runoff within 30 days. Paul Sisko, VOA News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul, for that report. To learn more about the latest developments on the ground, we are joined by my colleague, Vincent Macaulay, managing editor and anchor of VOA's Africa 54 news program. He joins us live via Skype from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Good evening, Vincent.
Good evening, Shaka.
How are you?
I'm doing well, man, in this very tense city.
Take care of yourself, man.
Yes.
Well, as an anxious nation awaits the election results, could you please describe to our audience and listeners the current atmosphere in the capital?
Well, at the moment, in parts of this city of Nairobi, there's a lot of anxiety, confusion, and tension. And this comes after the candidate for the opposition coalition, NASA, announced earlier in the day that the results that they're witnessing are fraudulent, that everything they're saying there is a sham. There's been massive interference through hacking of the electoral body's system. And because of that, actually, we've witnessed a few skirmishes on the peripheries of the city, particularly in the slums of Kibera and Kariobangi, but nothing really massive, nothing extremely violent. But there have been some protests on the streets in some of those parts of Nairobi.
Talk to me from the deepest, better part of basically really the Kenyan heart, your Kenyan heart and soul. Are you surprised at all, for example, that Mr. Odinga is coming up with this sort of complaints, especially given the history of Kenyan elections?
Of course, the claims for possible interference in the electoral process were flying around way before this election took place. And again, that is in the backdrop of the previous elections where Mr. Raila Odinga believes that he won the elections, but there was rigging, and therefore he was denied victory because of interference in the electoral process. But at this time also, I think there is a sense that perhaps there has been a rush to dismiss this election results because the process has not been concluded. Remember that the Electoral Commission, the Independent Electoral Commission, has documents to ensure that even if there is some interference in the electronic transmission of the results, which the Electoral Commission says are actually at the moment only provisional, there are ways and there are documents which have been signed by all the agents at the polling stations that will be brought to headquarters, and everybody will have access to it, to all those forms, including the media and, of course, all the political parties involved. And they will look at those numbers, compare with what was released on the screens of the IBC. But at the end of the day, the results from the so-called Form 34A and B are going to be the ones that will determine who really officially is the winner of this race.
We know, of course, that the electoral body is called the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. And that, of course, is in name. But what about the practice? Because a lot of people, in fact, say it may be, in fact, subordinate to the executive.
Now, the challenge there would be, how does somebody come to that conclusion, given that this is a brand new electoral commission? The previous one that conducted and ran the elections of 2013 was disbanded. Basically, they were all sent home. The new commissioners, the 7 commissioners, were selected through a very rigorous process, which was bipartisan and included also civil organizations. There has not been, I think, any evidence, at least as far as I can see, that they are partisan, because they're not handpicked by anybody. They went through a process of literally applying for those positions. They went through a process of being interviewed for the jobs, and there's nobody who can really for sure tell you that this particular commissioner is in the books of so-and-so or is working for any particular political party. So anything out there could be just conjecture, and at best it could end up actually kind of creating just a cloud, throwing a cloud over the Electoral Commission. Personally, I don't know anybody who can say for sure that they know that any of those commissioners have an allegiance to a particular political party.
Vincent, we know that the previous commission led by Mr. Is it Isaac Hassan?
Yes, Isaac Hassan. Mm-hmm.
We do know, for example, that there is overwhelming evidence that during the election of 2013, no candidate reached the threshold of 50+1. And yet, Uhuru Kenyatta was declared the president in the first run. If that is true, don't you honestly think that the public has a reason to be skeptical, especially given that the IEBC Secretariat remains the same?
The only problem here, I think, is that the process has not been concluded. The Electoral Commission has not released the official results. And the official results would only be released when all parties have looked at the Forms 34A. They have collected all the numbers from the different constituencies, and it is ideally a transparent process. At this moment, I think it will be unfair to consider that the IBC has declared the winner or loser, because what they say, when all those forms come in, and they're coming from 40,000 polling stations, over close to 95 or 96% of them have been delivered. They say they're going to look at all of those. They will cross-check with the agents of all these political parties, and then they'll make an announcement. I mean, at the moment, really, the Electoral Commission has not concluded its job, has not made an official announcement who is the winner. So however passionate you may be about a particular candidate, I think the citizens of Kenya deserve to be given an opportunity to see how the IEBC concludes this job, how they come to the final conclusion and kind of announce those results. So what is happening right now, there is, I think, a sense in which any effort now gets preempted, and you create a crisis where anybody who is losing, whether it's a governorship or a legislative position, is now starting to claim that those are fraudulent results, simply because the leader of the main opposition has made the same claim. So that creates an impression that the entire process right now is null and void, and that is declared before the process has been concluded.
Well, thank you very much, Vincent, for your insight.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Now, joining us here in our Washington studios are two distinguished guests. Claude Gatebuche, Executive Director of African Great Lakes Action Network, and Professor Kingsley Mohalu Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University here in the U.S. state of Massachusetts. Well, I have to say, gentlemen, that I am profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you, Shaka.
Thank you. Thank you, Shaka.
You're most
Glad
welcome.
to be here.
You're most welcome. And last but not least will be John Phillips, who is the CEO of Aristotle. We expect him to join us from our VOA studios in New York. And of course, you had already my interaction with Vincent. Your reaction?
I think it's important that the votes are completely tallied in Kenya, and I hope that at the end of the day, the voice of the people is represented in how the counting goes. I do understand the skepticism given the history of the Kenyan elections, and actually my heart goes out to the victims of the violence right now. I understand that some of the protesters have been shot dead, and that is a tragedy. But I do hope that the violence ends, and I hope that at the end of the day, what is, when the votes are verified outside of the electronic ballots, that the voice of the Kenyan people is heard clearly and loudly, although I do understand at the same time the skepticism of...
You know, it is very, very strange because Kenya, the last time I checked, got independence back in 1963. And frankly, if you look at the history of elections in Kenya, they have only had one election that has been credible, and that was 2002 under a gentleman called Samuel Kiwitu, who has since, of course, returned to his creator. And this man conducted the following election in 2007, whereby the incumbent president at that time, Mwai Kibaki, changed commissioners under this man. The secretariat remained the same. And of course, you know what happened in 2008. The election was stolen by Mr. Kibaki. In fact, I was told by Mr. Kiwitu himself in his offices in Nairobi, and later we had lunch at the Intercontinental Hotel in Nairobi. He told me exactly the same thing. There was also a very, very prominent individual in Kenya, a man called S.K. Macharia, who actually is the chairman of the Royal Media, which owns Citizen Television and Radio. Testifying to a Kenyan Senate, he actually said the 2007 elections were won by Raila Odinga, and he had all the evidence to boot. They were not won by Mr. Kibaki. Everybody knows that. And fine, now you told me about commissioners being changed, new commissioners, but the secretariat remains the same. What does that tell you?
I think there is definitely something that just doesn't smell right about the elections. And I will say, for the 2007 elections, I also don't believe that Mwai Kibaki won. And I also think that the international community failed the Kenyan people, especially the victims of the ensuing violence, where the military and the police were shooting civilians in the streets who were protesting, and the ICC went after Kenyatta instead of Kibaki, who was the commander-in-chief of the soldiers that were shooting the civilians in the streets. And I have no doubt that there was fraud in the 2000 elections. And for this one, because the process has not concluded, I hope to see that the real verification, from these international observers, verify all the ballots and go through the full-blown process and make sure that it really shows what the Kenyan people's choice is, the true choice.
What about the fact that the 2013 election, there is overwhelming evidence that neither Uhuru Kenyatta nor Raila Odinga, in fact, got the threshold, 50 plus 1 vote, 50% plus 1, but the election was declared in favor of Uhuru Kenyatta in the first round.
I think the Secretariat, the issue of the Secretariat, needs to be addressed. So the commissioner was changed, but with the same Secretariat that's been involved in suspect at best elections, should not be involved in the current elections or future elections, and that's going to continue to cast a cloud over whatever the results are. And I do think that in order to declare victory, you have to get 50 plus 1. Yeah, that's the rule. That's
and of course, 25% at least in 24 counties out of 47.
Yes, you got to get 25% out of more than 50% or 50% of the counties. And the announcement in 2013 was rushed, at best rushed, and should have been there should have been a runoff, given that the threshold was not achieved.
Very interesting. What about you, Professor Mohalu? I'm sure you've been following the developments in Kenya, have you?
Yes, I have. I think it throws up really the challenge we have with democracy in Africa. First of all, there's a winner-take-all tendency in Kenyan politics. And as Claude has eminently confirmed, there is a distinct lack of confidence in Kenya's electoral institutions. Now, I think, first of all, we cannot jump to conclusions about the result of this particular election, but whenever the results are declared, I would like to urge that there should be no violence, and that the government and civil society groups need to do everything possible to re-establish confidence in Kenya's electoral system. This means a clean sweep in the Secretariat, at the very least, and any other measures that need to be taken to make it clear that the Independent Electoral Commission is indeed independent, and that the results that are declared are indeed what the results were. Having said that, also, from what we know about this particular election, I think there isn't yet a lot of evidence to back up claims of fraud. I think we need to wait and see the paper results, which were signed by all the agents at the polling booths. Until that is done, and if there are any claims of electronic hacking, let's first of all match the paper results with the electronic results.
Right. And
if there's a disparity, then at that point you can begin to talk about hacking. I think it's a bit premature, for people to be going on protests in the streets, and the police are now shooting people. And this is a cycle of election violence that I think needs to end in Kenya. Kenya is one of Africa's most important countries and one of Africa's most important economies. It's the bedrock of the economy in East Africa. And I think, Kenyan citizens need to rise up and ensure the integrity of the electoral system going forward after this election. That's what I think, it should be. But let's not rush to conclusions.
Correct.
Yes, but I understand the skepticism because of the history of elections in Kenya. And indeed, many African countries suffer this problem. Democracy in this continent is essentially, at this point, largely a show. It is not something that we can say is real, in the sense that the people's wishes are truly and authentically expressed at every electoral exercise. We're doing these elections for the sake of appearing democratic, but behind the scenes, there's just so much foul practices that go on in many countries, not in all countries, but in many countries. And I think it's time the citizens of African countries woke up and challenged their leadership to ensure that democracy indeed is a reflection of the people's will.
Now, Professor, what about, in fact, some who have been saying that elections in Africa, most of the elections in Africa, not all of them, are not really meant for the primary stakeholder, who is the African citizen, but rather for the development partners who have to continue justifying giving aid to some of these non-democratic governments?
Indeed. I think, we know how democracy has evolved in African countries. At independence, in many African countries, democratic processes were indeed existing and taking place. Then there was the series of coups and counter-coups over 2 or 3 decades. Then democracy began to come back, but democracy began to come back only based on pressure by development aid partners on many African countries. And that is why elections in Africa have tended to be a process, but not something that actually, in substance, reflects the true will of the people. Now, concerning the role of the development partners, again, I want to say that we have a leadership challenge in the continent. With the exception of a number of countries in Africa, the capacity of the political leaders that are elected by these elections, because a lot of the elections actually are not free and fair, but the capacity of those leaders to bring development to their people is actually very weak. What does this mean? The role of the citizen is important. Examples in a number of countries have shown us that if citizens are able to rise up and demand genuine democracies, genuine elections, demand genuine leadership and results from their leaders, the dividends of democracy need to be delivered. We can't continue to have elections just for their own sake. Why should African countries be so reliant on development aid partners? That shows a deficit of a worldview. But that's a problem we have with leadership, and that's why we need to change the leadership in many African countries and elect people who have a different view of the world and a sense of self-reliance in driving the development of their countries. There are some countries where we've gotten this result, and I'm sure those countries have some controversies attached to them, and we will discuss them later in the program, I'm sure. But when you're talking about the dividends of democracy, I think we haven't got very good results yet in most of the continent.
What about the fact that you are a Nigerian?
Yes.
Nigeria got independence in 1960.
Yes.
You frankly didn't hold a credible, acceptable election until 2015. You almost did it in 1993, June 12th.
Yes.
Won by Billionaire Mashuda Biora, but annulled by General Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida.
Yes. Nigeria, which is Africa's largest country, most populous country, the biggest economy in the continent at this point, is a symptom or is an example of what's wrong with leadership in Africa. Like you rightly mentioned, the results of 2015 were credible. The results in 1993 were also credible, but they were annulled. The results in the elections in 1959 and in 1964 and several elections afterwards have always been disputed. The fundamental problem with democracy in Africa, in many African countries, including in Nigeria, is that democracy is not a battle of ideas. It is, in many African countries, including Nigeria, a struggle, and in Kenya, there's so many similarities between the electoral and democratic contexts of Kenya and Nigeria. The elections in Nigeria and the elections in Kenya are essentially ethnic contests. They are contests for control of governance by ethnic factions seeking to come to power and distribute state resources with patronage. So, again, I keep coming back to the role of the citizen. It's now up to the citizens in Nigeria to say that this cycle must end. Elections are not about where the candidates come from, what their ethnic identity is, or what their religion is. Elections in Nigeria should be about vision, should be about competence. It should be about what is the contest of ideas about how to govern a country of 180 million people, and who has a track record that shows evidence of the likelihood of success if that person is entrusted with power. This is what it should be. So Nigeria is, it's a situation, it's a country that has a similar problem as Kenya does. And I believe also, from what I can see in Nigeria, that the ground is beginning to shift. A lot of young people in Nigeria are becoming dissatisfied with the current order. And I think there is a growing tendency in Nigeria to move towards a youth-oriented leadership, a leadership that is more technocratically competent, more internationally and globally exposed.
I'm afraid
Yes.
time is not our best ally, Professor.
Sure.
You're tuned into Straight Talk Africa, and we'll have more of a discussion in a moment, including our social media segment, so please, don't go away.
Like Voice of America on Facebook. Follow VOA on Twitter. Join VOA on our YouTube channel. Like, follow, join VOA.
The lyrics could be French,
English,
Portuguese,
Bantu,
Arabic.
it is the beat.
The African beat that counts.
The beat does all the translations.
It cuts across all languages and gives us the understanding that this is the African beat.
It is so distinct
and adhesive.
It binds us together.
African Beat on the Voice of America. For more information, visit our website at www.voanews.com/AfricanBeat.
Welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. It's time to bring in my colleague and social media reporter, Ayen Bior. Take it away, Ayen.
Well, thanks, Shaka. Election fever swept across Rwanda and Kenya over the past week as President Paul Kagame was re-elected in Rwanda. But in Kenya, citizens are awaiting the final certified result from the Election Commission. Well, this leads us to our question of the week, which asks, following the elections, which country, Rwanda or Kenya, will have the best long-term future and why? Well, before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for using our social media platforms to communicate with us. And another reminder that we are tweeting live today. Use the hashtag VOA election results. And if you haven't yet, please follow us at VOA Shaka. Speaking of it, let's go to a tweet from Joseph Nkurunziza, who tweets, the long-term future depends on both the leadership and the governance of each country. And we have another tweet from Emmanuel Kachele. He says, Kenya will have a bright and long-term future. In Rwanda, citizens are greatly moved by a one-man show. Well, now to our comment of the week from Facebook fan David Onserio Munda in New York, who writes, I think Kenya has the best long-term future depending on how the country's political institutions manage the August 8th elections. Its elections are characterized by free, open, and vigorous debate, which led to a tight race between the two main presidential candidates. Meanwhile, Rwanda has been disappointing because the environment for the opposition to challenge the incumbent is non-existent. The more opposition voices are muzzled in Rwanda, the more its leader, Paul Kagame, will use intimidation and force to keep winning 99% of the vote. Well, let's go to another Facebook comment from Moses Imidu in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. He writes, how is it possible that for the last 13 years, Rwanda has failed to form a formidable opposition party? Is it a case of the government suppressing the opposition and never allowing an environment where people can participate freely in political activities? Well, that is a great question for the panel. Before we get to the panel, let's go to our last Facebook comment from Mamadou Berry, who writes, since the genocide, Rwanda has improved in development. When a president stays long in power, it doesn't mean that he is a dictator. When we look at the good record of President Kagame, he is far better than many other presidents in Africa. We need strong leaders that will put the interests of the people first. A very interesting round of comments. Now a reminder that we appreciate all of the audience feedback, so please keep them coming. And if you're a new fan, drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com. Once again, our email address is africatv@voanews.com, or you can post your comment on our Facebook page. Enter the keywords Straight Talk Africa. Interact with our show as it's streaming live. And be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com, or you can join our YouTube channel. Just sign up to VOA TV2 Africa. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at VOA Shaka. A reminder that the show is streaming live every Wednesday. Go to VOA Straight Talk Africa TV program page on our website, or you can simply watch us live on your mobile device. Just download the VOA mobile app. Now let's take a look at what's on tap for next week's program. On the next, Straight Talk Africa, troubling times in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The United States says it's concerned at the inability of both the DRC government and an opposition coalition to implement a political transition agreement reached last December. A DRC political discussion on the next Straight Talk Africa. Well, that's all for today's social media segment. Shaka, you and the guest have a lot of social media comments to discuss. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ian, for sharing with us some social media reaction. I now go to New York, where, of course, John Phillips, the CEO of Aristotle, is standing by. Good afternoon, John.
Good afternoon, Shaka.
How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. I'm glad to be here, and I very much appreciate your bringing me on the show.
Sorry about the logistics problem, of course, for you to access our studios in New York.
No problem.
Now, John, tell us very briefly, you were in Nairobi last week, and you were arrested or kidnapped, whatever it was, taken to the airport and later deported from the country on Saturday to the United States. Tell us a bit, what happened and why were you deported?
Well, I can't answer the second question, which is why were we deported. We were not charged with anything, and we were never told what the offense was. My colleague and I from Aristotle were in Kenya for 2 months approximately, and we were brought in at the invitation of NASA, which is the opposition party there, as everyone knows, to assist with election monitoring, communications, and all aspects of the campaign. We were not the only experts, campaign experts brought in on either side. There were many on both sides. Campaigns are complicated affairs, especially a presidential campaign in a country as important as Kenya. So we were there for 2 months. On Friday night, armed men broke in the door of my apartment, or burst in the door of my apartment in Nairobi, and also grabbed a colleague I was with who was on his way out of the complex at the time. We were held for 26 hours. We were prevented from contacting the U.S. Embassy or the Canadian Embassy. My colleague is a Canadian citizen, for up until the late morning of Saturday, at which point the embassy officials were able to, including the works of the ambassador and the high commissioner, were able to secure our release. But we were deported 26 hours after being abducted from our apartments. So I can't tell you why. I don't know why. Now,
John, you say that you can't tell us why, and yet Kenyan authorities actually say that you happen to have been there illegally, at least in terms of working. Did you have any work permit?
What we had was, we had filed for the work permit and we had been given a tourist permit. And several weeks after we arrived, the paperwork had been filed. It had not been acted on by the Kenyan authorities. If this is the excuse they're using for abducting two foreigners who've been invited in by the party and then detaining them and preventing them from contacting the embassy, But detaining them for 26 hours, it's a rather flimsy excuse, I think. Let's be clear. This was a political action by a regime which wanted to take any step possible and was willing to do anything to ensure their continuation in power. If you can't look at this in a vacuum, you look at the murder of the election official and the discrepancies in the vote counts today. This is all part of a continuum, and the Kenyan citizens and the Kenyan voters deserve better than this.
Now, John, you talk about an electoral official. You're talking about, of course, Chris Musando, the IT expert at the IEBC. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. It was a tragedy for Chris, of course. He was murdered. It was a tragedy for Chris and his family and his kids, but it was also a tragedy for the Kenyan people, because Chris was instrumental in working towards a transparent and a fair electoral process. The government is responsible for protecting people who are involved in the electoral process, including the commissioners and including the employees. And on this count, they clearly failed. Whether it was intentional or not, we don't know.
You talk about Chris was murdered for political reasons, but a lot of people, in fact, are saying that you're looking at a love triangle. You know that they did find a body of a young lady next to him. Have you heard about that?
Sure. And, you know, I imagine if my body had been found, there would have been some reason other than the fact that I was working with NASA, and it was a successful campaign that was the reason why I was killed. You know, you can make up whatever excuse you want. I think people understand that when the key election official, the IT manager with the codes, is found murdered a week and a half before the election, there's something going on here. You know, this is a autocratic regime masquerading as as Democrats, but they're still autocrats, and they use the instruments of state power to prevent a free and fair election.
John, I don't think that the Kenyan government is probably as autocratic as many other African governments, really. I think they did have very good campaigns, as a matter of fact. But you talk about Chris Musando being a key player. You know, the postmortem indicates that he had actually been tortured, he had been strangled, and they even cut off his arm. What would that mean, cutting off his arm? What would they do with that arm, for example, those people who cut him?
You know, I'm not a forensic detective, so I can't tell you what the purpose was for cutting off his arm, or for the circumstances. I think the authorities know a lot more than they have. The investigating authorities know a lot more. But I think you're going to need to direct those questions to the government itself. Clearly, this is not normal, and there was information perhaps that was extracted from Chris. I don't know.
Now, I'm sure you're aware of some people stormed into the NASA Tally Center in Westlands. Were you aware of that?
Yeah, that occurred. You're talking about the storming of the vote tallying center,
yes,
correct?
In Westlands, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that occurred at approximately the same time that we were abducted. And you know, again, the government denied that they were involved in that, but you know, Kenyans are smart enough to be able to put two and two together.
Were you connected with that Tally Center?
We were not connected with the Tally Center, except that we were involved in many aspects of the campaign.
Is it true that government authorities, security forces, were in fact monitoring you 24/7, especially when you were talking to opposition leader Raila Odinga?
We believe that our communications were monitored, and both the electronic and we understood that we were being followed at different times especially towards the end of the campaign. Look, the nature of this campaign was such that Kenyan voters were very focused on not just the personalities but the policies of these two candidates. I've worked all over the world in political campaigns under difficult circumstances like Afghanistan or Venezuela or Ukraine. But you know, we're used to the government overstepping its bounds in order to cling to power. But it was clear in Kenya that this government was willing to go to extreme lengths by virtue of the fact that they were shadowing not just the candidate, but people like myself who were playing a relatively minor role. So this election, I think, if you look at the pace of the election, I suspect that the Jubilee Party and that President Kenyatta lost this election well before Election Day if the votes were to be fairly counted. He didn't show up for a debate. And not showing up for the one televised debate gave Raila Odinga an opportunity to talk directly to the Kenyan people, many of whom might have dismissed him prior to this Monday evening debate in Nairobi. And he appeared reasonable and thoughtful, and he had concrete solutions to problems of joblessness and corruption, poor education, poor health care, congestion and infrastructure. So I think that was the turning point in the election campaign, and it was a moment at which President Kenyatta decided not to show up, and then the next day he was quite dismissive of the Kenyan people and the need for debate or open discussion. And I think from that point on, the polling showed that Odinga was pulling ahead steadily through Election Day.
John, earlier you told me that you also happened to be in Uganda during last year's elections. Is that okay? Is that fine?
That's correct. Yep.
Do you see
That's
any similarities, any semblances, also aspects of it between what happened in Uganda and probably what happened in Kenya?
Well, you can always draw parallels between, two different election campaigns. In the case of Uganda, Kizza Besigye, for whom we were working, was imprisoned during the election campaign, and in fact, the election was the government there was even more blatant in terms of the way they went about rigging the system. As your earlier guest pointed out quite correctly, I think, election rigging is not just an African phenomenon, and it's not something that just happens in Kenya or Uganda. You can see that around the world. The difference here is the blatantness with which the results are rigged. And you see, unfortunately, in Kenya, a great country with great people and some great institutions to guarantee a democratic outcome. You see the government in power doing whatever it can more and more blatantly as exhibited in some of the neighboring states, and that's very unfortunate. But this is going to be up to the Kenyan people now. It depends on what the actual vote tally is. I would tell people to refrain from drawing any conclusion about who won this election until all the votes are counted. And all the votes have to be counted for this to be legitimate.
What about the role of the international community, especially the international election observers there, really? I mean, we know, for example, that this time around, the European Union decided not to send any delegation to Rwanda because they didn't frankly think that was a very serious election. They happen to be in Kenya right now. What would you suggest or advise that the international observers do? Some people have suggested that perhaps they should in fact suggest that one of the ways of resolving this problem is demand for an independent international election audit. What about that?
Sure. I mean, that is one mechanism available to the observers. I met with NASA. We met with the international observers in the days leading up to the election campaign, and pointed out the discrepancies in terms of the conduct of the election. For instance, the electoral roll, which was full of names of dead people, for instance. An audit of the election results is almost certainly going to have to take place. But again, we're not there yet. There needs to be a correct accounting of the votes in the country that were cast yesterday. And when that happens, we'll see who the winner is of this election.
Thank you very much, John. Claude, an election audit. Is that something that you think would probably help to add value here, because let's face it, there are precedents. We have had an election audit in Afghanistan, in Haiti, in Kosovo. Why not Africa?
I think it's important that there is an audit of the election results, but not only an audit on the physical ballots. There also needs to be, in order for this to be settled, and in order to calm the people down and give more credibility to this vote, there needs to be an IT audit. Yeah. There needs to be today we have the technology.
An independent,
to trail.
An independent audit,
yes,
not the
not by the government.
IEBC actually sort of investigating itself.
No, not by anyone involved in these elections. It needs to be independent outside audit. An audit needs to be done by somebody else, an outsider anyway, in order for it to be credible. So it needs to be a credible, independent audit, and there needs to be a trace. And there is enough technology now to actually trace back steps, not only physical paper
digital
trail, but digital, yes.
And
I think
and all
that's
that
important.
Kind of stuff, communications.
Everything in the computers and everything, and there are cameras, and there are all kinds of things that you can connect together and make sure that technologically you can trace back to the very first step. And then in addition to that, there needs to be an independent audit of the vote tally. So I think that's going to be important for Kenya to move forward. I do think that the Kenyans have demonstrated that Kenya is a country that has a lot of freedoms. The process and the election process has been very democratic.
They are very highly educated people.
That's true.
A lot of people that are socially, politically conscious, politically aware, very highly urbanized.
That's true.
You know, there is a saying that there is no politics that supersedes the politics of the stomach. So you're talking about an environment, for example, where people cannot even afford the basic food items, like ugali. People cannot afford milk, you know, that kind of stuff. There is a lot of corruption, a lot of nepotism, and what have you. But, you know, the government keeps winning.
It's a game changer. When the people cannot eat, when the people can get the basic needs met, they will demand change.
But what about if people can actually say, yes, he may actually be all that bad, but he's our bad president?
That's sometimes the case also. And Kenya tends to vote along ethnic lines, along tribal lines, and I'm very sure that there are people who vote that way. And we also hear that from the international community about Paul Kagame, since we're talking about the Rwandan elections. You know, he's a dictator, but he's our guy. He's our kind of guy. That's what former President Bill Clinton said. And I do think that the Rwandan people need to grow the spirit of the Kenyan people, because what's happening now in Rwanda, you have, you know, Paul Kagame getting coronated 99%. And I heard a Kenyan analyst say this was during the quote-unquote election process in Rwanda, which was a coronation process, where this analyst said what's happening in Rwanda is political nonsense.
The perfect election.
Right. And today, I'm not sure which one is more ridiculous, the campaign or the celebration after the 99% win.
What about some people, in fact, who suggested that when, you know, the election in Rwanda, really, when people like Kagame and Habineza were campaigning, you were pretty much looking at, in their words, not mine, some kind of military political operation, not campaigning, really.
Can I interject here? I think there is a problem we have, and I'm not saying that there are no issues in Rwanda. I think the political space in Rwanda needs to be opened up more.
How?
How? Because the Rwandan government needs to allow opposition parties to operate more freely.
They say they are free. Everything is free.
Well, but there were people who were arrested just before the election. and prevented from getting onto the ballot. I mean,
you're talking about Diana, Ms. Diana.
Precisely.
We got it, yeah.
Yes. Now, so that's.
But she's perhaps only one of those 10 people.
Yes.
In 2015, who said no to changing the constitution.
That's what I'm saying. There needs to be more political pluralism in Rwanda, clearly. Having said that, I think we should not conflate two things: leadership and elections. Africa needs a lot more leadership. Africa is having a lot of elections, but they're not getting a lot of leaders.
Are they in fact elections? Or?
In Rwanda, leadership exists. The results are clear. Those results are in the economic realm. Those results are in the facts that the country is moving forward after the genocide. From a very poor country, we can see a lot of development.
By the way, I can tell you, I come from Kabale, southwestern Uganda, which is borders basically Rwanda.
Yeah.
Rwanda, under Habyarimana, was in fact developed.
Let me explain. I know Rwanda fairly. You cannot compare Rwanda under Habyarimana
We'll have
Rwanda today.
We'll have a show on that because we really don't have
there is just no comparison.
We'll have
but the point I want to make, the real point that I want to make is that Kagame in Rwanda, there is room to criticize
I will bring you, we'll talk about that.
But the point I'm trying to make is that he is providing leadership that is generating important results to the standard of life of Rwandan citizens. Now, the real challenge that faces Kagame is his succession.
Let's have a show on that. Let me go to New York to John because time is not our best ally. John, final question. What about the issue of Chris Musando? There were offers from U.S. ambassador to Kenya and the British High Commissioner to Kenya that they could provide, for example, FBI and London Scotland Yard to investigate, but we haven't really had the response from the Kenyan government.
You know, that's a great question. Why not accept this assistance? You know, when we were rescued, there was an FBI representative, as well as the United States Embassy, as well as the Canadian High Commissioner that intervened. So it was I don't know why you wouldn't want to take advantage of the two premier law enforcement agencies in the world to solve the mystery of Chris Musando's murder. Let me just say this. You know, the public opinion pollings in Kenya leading up to the election showed that 65% of Kenyans across all tribes were dissatisfied with the direction of the country, and over 50% held the Jubilee government accountable for that. When young people can't get jobs, they play by the rules, they go to school, they listen to their parents, and then they graduate and they have education debt and they can't get a job. Well, that is what drives this election. It's that as much as the electoral fairness that I think you're seeing in Kenya.
Thank you. I'm afraid we ran out of time. On that note, thanks to our distinguished guests, Kelodi Gatebuche, Professor Kingsley Mohalu, and John Phillips, who joined us from New York. Thanks to our affiliate stations, along with our viewers and listeners, we thank you for tuning in. For many of our Voice of America radio affiliates, Learning English is coming up next. And tomorrow morning's Daybreak Africa with James Bate. On behalf of the Voice of America, thanks for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter, Kenya. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.